This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. An Evening Standard poll is revealing a record slump in support for the government's coronavirus strategy. Those who say it's been handled well have dropped in a month from 42 to just 32%. The survey by Ipsos Mori also shows the number of people who think it's been handled badly has jumped from 40 to 50%. That's a negative 18 difference, the worst recorded by the pollster. It used to be a positive score of 2. Our editorial column says Boris Johnson has to tell us what the end game is.
As our poll shows today, confidence in the government's ability to deal with COVID-19 is falling away fast. It is trying to run a response for the whole of England, and it isn't working. We do not oppose the new restrictions, but alongside them we also need to know what the government's aim is. To live with COVID-19, to eradicate it, to hope for a vaccine. We need to know too what will be done to support businesses in our city and get them open as fast as possible. We need to know what assessment is being made of the damage being done to our city's economy. And because our government cannot answer these questions, we need London to lead.
So what's behind the apparent flip-flops in messaging, the confusing rules about who can go where, with whom, and do what? And McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist, has written a column for the Evening Standard looking at what's happening inside the cabinet, and she's with me now. Anne, in your piece you're writing about hawks and doves and a divide inside government. What is going on at number 10?
I think this hawks and dove divide goes back to the beginning of the pandemic. And broadly speaking, if you're a hawk, you're very concerned about the impact on the economy. You're worried about the trade-offs of lockdowns and of very stringent measures that stop people getting out and about and being economically active, particularly in a great city like London, where the centre sort of thrives on that. And if you're a dove, this is an old reference to war and peace and how you go about this kind of conflict, you are most concerned about flattening the curve of the infection and stopping its spread, and you think that almost anything else should be secondary to that. And in effect, government is a trade-off of these two things, and Boris Johnson sits across this divide at the centre of it.
But how is he handling that divide? How is he going about dealing with what must be difficult negotiations within his own party?
I think partly as a result of having had COVID himself, I think he had a very rude awakening that instinctively he would have sided with the hawks. He would have been on the more economic side of the argument. That's the side represented by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, in cabinet debates, but particularly in the wake of having had the virus and also the seriousness and seeing the death rate and the rate of infections rising again, he does clearly give considerable bandwidth to the argument of Matt Hancock, his health secretary. So that's why we got the statement that we got on television and in Parliament this week, which seem to walk that line and are trying to constrain our freedoms, but at the same time not doing that fuller, kind of almost a lockdown that you're seeing coming back again north of the border in Scotland. I think he finds it very difficult. I think instinctively he's very clearly on, as he would put it, the more freedom-loving side of the argument. But I think he also knows his premiership is very vulnerable if he is seen to fail again at containing the virus.
By trying to make these compromises, though, is that what's behind what a lot of people are saying is a confused message that the public don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing at the moment?
I think when you try to walk this line, inevitably you end up with your own trade-offs and some confusions, and you get to that point about why should pubs close at 10 or why 6 and not 7, and can it be outdoors, not indoors, etc. The only thing I would say about that is I don't know any country in Europe where they are tackling the pandemic reasonably well, where there is not an argument saying, oh, well, you don't have to wear a mask at school in Bavaria, but you do in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, for instance. So there are always these kind of ambiguities or differences built in. I think the difficulty was that Boris Johnson clearly, with Rishi Sunak pushing hard to get the economy fired up again, and the stats were not looking too bad actually, wanted to get us all back to the office. They wanted us out and about and doing that occasional shopping or impulse buying that we tend to do when we're out of our houses. We don't do so much when I'm talking to you here from the back bedroom at home. And that came just at the time when the R rate rose dramatically. So they did have to do a screeching reverse ferret and tell everyone to start staying home again. And I think that has come across as being a bit inconsistent, and that maybe it would be better just to level with the public and say, look, I'm sorry, when we said X, we didn't know Y. But there's a limit probably politically to how many times you can do that, and your enemies will be straight after you every time you do.
Is it not an extraordinary situation, though, Anne, when you have a Prime Minister who had such a big victory at the last general election, which wasn't all that long ago? He's got this majority of 80, and now people are talking about his vulnerability.
Yes, an 80 majority is a very healthy majority, but it doesn't feel like an 80 majority if you're watching events closely at Westminster, as I've been doing in the last few weeks. I'd say well over half of that majority are not necessarily going to vote with him on if they got the chance to vote on COVID restrictions. So when we talk about majority, we sort of forget it's good for some things. It's not always good for others. It's probably quite good for him if he ever needed to have a showdown with Parliament on a trade deal, on something to do with the EU, but it's not necessarily that resilient when it comes to COVID-19. And the Tory party particularly is more of a home of people who prefer the hawky position to the dove position, people who are always on at you to put your masks back on and to take due care, all the rest of it. Some of them can definitely be Conservatives. The Health Secretary is one. But, there's often more of a spread to the left of centre and more of the economic freedom fighters on the right. So I think that's the position that's made him feel a bit vulnerable. And you can also criticise some of his dealings with his own party. His diplomacy in Parliament last week was not good. He still looks a bit grudging and a little bit knocked.
What does happen next, Anne? We've had his address. He's spoken to Parliament. What's going to happen next?
He very much hopes that by just taking that edge off how many people we meet, how long we stay out in the evening, how many beers or wines we have at the pub, and we lose our inhibitions and start to sort of pat each other on the back or kiss each other on the cheek, that brings down the infection rate. I'm thinking here specifically of London. I think he hopes that he can get away with that, but I do believe that there are contingency plans for a stricter lockdown in the capital as elsewhere, and he hopes it'll be short and sharp. What he doesn't want to do is see Parliament voting on it very much, David, because I think he will try to buy off some good opinion with the backbenchers and with the committee. He's putting some pressure on him at the moment there, but he doesn't really want every single detail of this going through the parliamentary mill, because that 80 majority, big as it looks, it would very quickly splinter if every single lockdown decision were put in front of Tory MPs.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.